Hey, thank you, Rod. Can you hear me? I'm going to stand out here instead of on that stage. I'm a kind of a fidgety guy, so putting me up there is not a good idea. By the way, I do have a little bit of a North Carolina background. In 1989, I did a sabbatical at NC State, so I spent some time there. 1989. By the way, in 1989, you could smoke a cigarette in the grocery store and throw the butt out on the floor. Honest to God. And I had just quit smoking when I came here, so God, it was killing me, I got to tell you. But it's great to be back. Good to see Rachel on your staff, another Illinois native. So this is sort of the Illinois part of the program. I'm going to talk to you about soybean, and being the educator I am, I'm going to start off with a quiz question. And the quiz question is, what is the world record soybean yield and what's known as the soybean yield gap? World record soybean yield. I know you know who it used to be. It was that guy from Missouri. Remember him? Kip Cullers? That guy was a jackass, I got to tell you. But happily, he is no longer the world soybean record holder. The world record soybean is 171.8 bushels. That was Randy Dowdy. It was last year. So that's the world record. Now, if you look at the U.S. average soybean yield last year the average U.S. soybean yield was 50 bushels. By the way, I think the North Carolina soybean average was 40 bushels. So you guys are below average. And I know all about below average, having a name like Below. So I sympathize with you. That's the yield gap, the difference between the world record and the average yield. That's 121 bushels. And I like to think of that as the opportunity to increase soybean yield with better crop management. Now, if I want high soybean yield, I want to know those factors that each year impact soybean yield. And that's my so-called, that's my so-called 6 secrets of soybean success. It's the 6 factors that each year can have a positive impact on soybean yield. And I got to give you a little story behind this. I spent most of my career working on corn. But 7 years ago, the Illinois Soybean Association came to me, and they said, we'd like you to consider working on soybean. They said, we'd like to make soybean yield sexy. And if you can make soybean yield sexy, we got a huge bucket of Illinois checkoff dollars, which are yours. And oh boy, did that get my attention. Man, I wanted those checkoff dollars bad. But the caveat was I had to make soybean yield sexy. And I thought to myself, how on earth am I going to make soybean yield sexy? I mean, it is, after all, soybean. Get my hands on those checkoff dollars. And I thought about it and thought about it and thought about it, and I couldn't think of any way to make soybean yield sexy. So I asked my good friend Victoria if she had any ideas. And by the way, Victoria is fairly attractive. And Victoria said, if it's going to be sexy, it has to be secret. Apparently, Victoria had some secrets. I mean, who would have thought? And hence, the 6 secrets of soybean success. But I don't keep a secret very well, because I'm going to tell them all to you. Now, but before I get into the soybean secrets, there are some good things about soybean that are not soybean secrets. They're one of the main reasons we grow soybean in my state as a rotational crop to the corn. Because if soybean was the previous crop to the corn, your corn yield scores 25 bushels better. And you get to use a little less nitrogen. It's the so-called soybean nitrogen credit. So that's an advantage of soybean as a rotational crop. The other advantage of soybean compared to corn is that soybean compared to corn improves the tilth of the soil. And it has to do with the difference in the crop's rooting habit. By the way, soybean is a taproot crop, and taproot crops naturally fracture soil compaction. I mean, think about the tillage radish, right? If you grow that sucker, you don't even have to till. Now, I'm not going to tell you that soybean taproot is as good as a tillage radish. But if you got 120,000 of them out there, you can fracture some soil compaction compared to corn. And any one of you who's ever chisel plowed corn or soybean stubble, you know those crops work up differently. I'm going to show you one day after a fall chisel plow So this is one day after a fall chisel plow where soybean was the previous crop. This is compared to third-year corn residue. And talk about a difference in soil tilth. On the soybean side, I refer to this as mellow. I mean, I could skip across here in my bare feet. But when I got to the corn side, I might sprain my ankle, fall down, gouge my eye out on a piece of stalk residue. And of course, the problem is root balls. Corn plants with that fibrous root system glue soil particles to their roots. So which one of these do you think is the better seedbed for your next year's corn? I'm going with this one. That is not a soybean secret, but it is an advantage of soybean in the rotation. Now, before I get to the secrets, there are some prerequisites. There's some table stakes. There's some things that you have to have in place first. And I don't mean they're not important, they're actually crucial. But either in and of themselves, they don't add yield, or they don't need to be done every year. So soybean, here's the crucial prerequisites. Oh man, does soybean hate having wet feet? So does it need drainage? Weed control. I'm going to tell you, until fairly recently, weed control was underrated in soybean. I mean, remember the good old days? This is like 15 years ago. Here's what I'd do. I'd let my weeds grow up good and tall, and I'd hit them once with Roundup. And by the time I got around to harvesting my 30 bushels, man, there wasn't a weed out there. God, did that feel good, But I wonder how much yield we gave up before we controlled those weeds. And of course, now we have Roundup-resistant weeds. So can't overstate the importance of weed control. And soybean's really finicky when it comes to the pH. I mean, the reason you lime or control the pH isn't necessarily for the corn, it's for the soybean. If the pH is too happy, if the pH is too high, soybean's unhappy. If it's too low, it's unhappy. It's got to be just right. All right, so those are the crucial prerequisites. And then what are the 6 secrets of soybean success? I'm going to go through each one of these, and I'm going to justify each one of them with a little bit of data. And I'm going to start at the top and work my way down. And by the way, you already know the factor that has the biggest impact on your soybean yield. It's the one you have the least control over, the weather, Mother Nature. By the way, here's where I like to make a smug recommendation for high soybean yield, and it goes like this. Plant early. All right, well, good luck with that if the weather's not in the mode. It's the weather that dictates when you could plant, and the weather after you plant that dictates the success of the planting date. And as much as I think you should be planting soybean early planting is not one of the 6 secrets because it is completely determined by the weather. Now, that said, I will tell you, if you can plant your soybean earlier, it will help. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some of our trials in Illinois over the last, I think it's 5 years. And these are not planting date trials. They just happen to be the control plots of our trials. But I'm going to show you what the yield was as a function of when we planted it. So I have that here. So what I'm showing you here, these are different trials that we did over the last 5 years. And I'm showing you the yield as a function of planting date. And I hope you can see that the earlier you plant, the greater the potential yield. And by the way, this is especially true if you get the rain in August. So early planting is not a bad thing. I don't know about you guys here, but I'm too busy planting corn, to worry about soybean. But if I could get the soybean in earlier, it would really help. All right, well, moving on in the 6 secrets. What I'm going to tell you is weather is always number 1. But the order of the other 5 secrets can change depending on that year's weather. I'm going to put them in an order, but I'm going to caution you that the order I put them in a given weather year might be different. All right, so given that, what do you think the second secret of soybean success is? It is fertility. And this largely has to do with the fact that most growers aren't adequately fertilizing their soybean. And when they are fertilizing their soybean, they're fertilizing it with the wrong nutrient. And I'm going to try and prove this to you. I know why a lot of growers don't adequately fertilize their soybean compared to corn. And the reason is that soybean gets some of its nitrogen from the nodules. I know you know this story, right? The the rhizobium, the bradyrhizobium in the nodules, the soybean plant gives those bacteria sugars, and in return, the bacteria take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and give some of it to the soybean. That's called biological nitrogen fixation. And the key term is some, not all. I have another question for you, and the question is, how much of the soybean how much of the nitrogen that soybean needs comes from the nodules? And by the way, it's not all, or I wouldn't have used the term some. Anybody know? So how much of soybeans' nitrogen comes from the nodules? Well, the answer is about half, 50%. Where does the rest of it come from? The soil and the breakdown of the previous corn crop's residue. So soybean only gets about half of its N from the nodules. And by the way, soybean is a huge nitrogen-requiring crop. I got another question for you, and the question is, how much nitrogen does soybean need to accumulate for every bushel? How many pounds of nitrogen does the soybean crop need to accumulate for every bushel? I'll give you a hint. For corn, it's about 1 pound per bushel. So what do you think soybean needs? Soybean needs between 4 and 5 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. Way more than corn. And this has to do with the higher concentration of nitrogen, of protein in the soybean seed. So the soybean crop needs to accumulate 4 or 5 pounds of nitrogen per bushel. This is a huge amount. Now, I'm going to show you how soybean does it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the uptake and partitioning pattern of 60 bushel soybean. So what I'm showing you here, this is nitrogen uptake. Partitioning means where it is in the plant for 60 bushel soybean. 60 bushel soybean is a fairly modest yield by Illinois standards. And so what I'm showing you here, I'm showing you the pattern over time, days after planting on this growth stage. So in other words, this 60 bushel soybean crop has to take up 245 pounds of N over the course of the growing season. So by the way, if I know this, if I have a graph like this, I know that 60 bushel soybean has to accumulate 245 pounds of N. I know where it is in the plant, the leaf, the pod, the stem, and if I know that half of it comes from the nodules, so in other words, 4 or 5 pounds of N, 245 pounds, if I have a graph like this, I can calculate how much nitrogen that 60 bushel soybean crop leaves for the next corn crop. All right, and I've done that here. I know this is complicated, but what I've shown you here is this 60 bushel soybean crop has to accumulate 245 pounds of N. Half of it comes from the nodules. I divided that by 2. I know that this 60 bushel soybean crop removes 179 pounds of N with the seed. And so that means that 60 bushel soybean crop actually removes 56 pounds of N from the soil. By the way, soybean does not add N to the soil. There is no such thing as a soybean nitrogen credit. This is the biggest rural myth of all time. Soybean does not add N to the soil. It's a corn residue penalty. Now I know a lot of you learned that for every bushel of soybean you got 1 pound of N. I learned the same thing. It's exactly the opposite. Soybean does not add N to the soil. If I teach you anything here today, that's it. No such thing as a soybean nitrogen credit. Now, I mean, if you take the credit, it's the right result for the wrong reason. I mean, if you want to hammer your soil nitrogen fast, just grow soybean a couple years in a row. I'll guarantee you, you'll hammer it. And that's because it's a big nitrogen requiring crop and it only gets half of its N from the nodules. All right, well, that's one of the reasons that fertility is number 2. The other reason that fertility is number 2 has to do with the way that most growers fertilize soybean. Now, I don't know about North Carolina growers, but I can tell you a typical fertilization strategy for soybean in Illinois, and it's called fertilize the corn. This is what your typical grower in Illinois would do. They'd put 180 pounds of N on their corn. By the way, when they fill out the water quality survey, they write 160. But I guarantee you they snuck another 20 out there. They'd put 90 pounds of P2O5 in their corn, and this potassium's probably high, but I'll say 100 pounds K2O. They don't put any sulfur, any micronutrients, and 75% of growers in Illinois put no fertilizer whatsoever on their soybean. 75%. By the way, 5 years ago it was 80%, so we've made some progress. Now, I don't know how many of you fall into this category, right, or if you're willing to admit it, but this allegedly is enough nitrogen, enough fertility for the corn and the soybean. Now, by the way, if 75% of growers in Illinois didn't fertilize soybean, this would lead me to believe that soybean doesn't require much nutrients, and that would be wrong. So I'm showing you here my 6 favorite nutrients for soybean. So what I'm showing you here for 60 bushel soybean of my 6 favorite nutrients is how much of each of these nutrients is required to produce the crop. Okay, that's how much the crop has to suck up over the course of the growing season, either from fertilizer or the soil. Well, and half the end comes from the nodules. I also show you here how much is removed with the grain. So when you harvest 60 bushel soybean, this is the amount of each of these nutrients that you physically remove from your field and send someplace else. And I'm guessing if somehow economic and trade times are good, somehow this all ultimately ends up in China. Well, not today, but hopefully in the future. And that's analogous to fertilizer maintenance. And then I'm also showing you what's known as the harvest index. And the harvest index is, of the amount the crop sucks up, what percentage is removed with the grain? And I want you to notice that all nutrients do not have the same harvest index value. Now, I have 2 criteria for an important nutrient in soybean. So there's 2 criteria that allow the nutrient to make this list. And number 2, the number 2 criteria for an important nutrient in soybean is that the plant needs to accumulate a lot of it, and it needs to accumulate a lot of it in a short amount of time. And that would be true of nitrogen and potassium. I don't know if you can see the red here, but notice these numbers are higher. That's my number 2 requirement. My number 1 requirement, and this is by far the most important one, is that the nutrient has a high harvest index value. Okay, remember the harvest index is, of the amount the crop takes up, what percentage is removed with the grain? Now, if I want a lot of grain, then my stupid thinking is those nutrients where most of what the crop takes up ends up in the grain must be pretty important for high grain yield. And based on that criteria, my 3 favorite elements for high soybean yield are nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. I want you to notice they have the highest harvest index values of all. Now, again, I don't know about North Carolina, but if I go to Illinois and I ask 10 farmers, 10 agronomists, which one of these elements is the most important for high soybean yield? 9 of them are going to tell me it's potassium. Well, and they'd be wrong. It's not that they'd be wrong completely. It's that they would be overlooking the importance of phosphorus. And I'm going to try and prove this to you. And you need to remember these 2 numbers. You need to remember how Illinois farmers are fertilizing soybean. You need to remember 90 pounds P2O5, 100 pounds K2O on the corn. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare the uptake and removal of 230 bushel corn with 60 bushel soybean. Right, 230 bushel corn is fairly common in Illinois. I mean, we have something in Illinois called soil. I mean, personally, I think Blacklands is a little overnamed. I looked at the area, but who am I to say? I mean, if you want to see Blacklands, come to Illinois. So 230 bushel corn is fairly common in Illinois. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare for potassium and phosphorus the uptake and removal of 230 bushel corn and 60 bushel soybean. And I know there's a lot of numbers here. So what I'm showing you for phosphorus and potassium required to produce, that's the amount the crop has to suck up, removed with the grain, again this is 60 bushel soybean or 230 bushel corn, and I have remain in stover. Some of you call stover trash, but it's kind of hard for me to refer to that as trash when it got all that nutrient in it. And in case you didn't notice, I abbreviated soybean soy. Now, it is true that soybean needs a lot of potassium. A 60 bushel soybean crop has to suck up almost as much potassium as does a 230 bushel corn crop. And it actually removes more. So 60 bushel soybean removes more potassium than 230 bushel corn. I think this is what leads to the misconception that potassium is the most important element for soybean productivity. Now remember how Illinois growers fertilize, they put 100 pounds K2O on their corn. It's not enough, but the good news is the corn grain only removes 56. And that means in that corn stover, there's 124 pounds of potassium. And by the way, potassium does not occur in organic form, so every molecule of that potassium in that corn stover is available for next year's soybean crop. In fact, two-thirds of the potassium that soybean needs is in the corn stover. Actually, if you look at there's a lot of potassium in soybean stover too, so almost two-thirds of the potassium corn needs is in soybean stover. And I'm here to tell you that a potassium molecule in stover is worth about 3 times its value as a fertilizer. It's the stover that's saving you. As long as you adequately fertilize the corn and don't remove the stover, if you remove the stover, it's a whole other story. If you don't remove the stover supplies the potassium that corn needs. So if I look at how much potassium I removed in a corn-soybean rotation, that's 126? I only put 100 pounds on, so I actually mined the soil, 26 pounds of potassium, but the stover saves me. Whole nother story for phosphorus. Remember I said Illinois growers put 90 pounds P2O5 in their corn. The crop needs 101, so they're already short, and it actually removes 80. So let me think here, of the 90 pounds I put on, I only left 10 for the soybean, which, by the way, needs 43 and removes 35. Now, there is a little bit of potassium in the stover, or phosphorus in the stover, but that's in organic form, and you're lucky if half of that's released to the next crop. So unlike potassium, phosphorus in the stover doesn't save me. You know, if I look at how much phosphorus I'm removing in a corn-soybean rotation, that's 115 pounds. I only put 90 on. So I mined the soil 25 pounds. I don't have time to show it all to you today, but I was really happy to hear Dr. Hardy saying none of his trials did potassium increase soybean yield. It's the exact same thing that I see. You know, I could show you dozens of trials where as long as I leave the corn stover, the potassium doesn't increase yield. And by the way, the soil test data would tell me it might, but it doesn't. So I'm going to try to further prove it to you that it's phosphorus rather than potassium that's the major element for soybean production by comparing the uptake and partitioning patterns of potassium and phosphorus. So I'll start with potassium. And I don't mean that potassium's not important for soybean, it actually is. So soybean needs to accumulate a lot of potassium. It needs to accumulate in a short amount of time. So again, I'm showing you the uptake pattern, 60 bushel soybean, pounds K2O function of time, where it is in the plant. And boy, I mean, it needs a lot of potassium. There's a 50-day period right here where that plant has to suck up 3.5 pounds of K2O per acre per day. I mean, so it needs a lot of it. But I want to ask you, where is most of the potassium in the soybean plant? Where does most of the potassium go in the soybean plant? In other words, which one of these fractions is the largest? Well, it's that one right there. It's in the stem. Half of the potassium that soybean takes up is in the stem or the leaf petioles, where, by the way, it is freely mobile. So that means all of the potassium that the grain needs can be met by taking it out of the stem. Now, I want you to compare this uptake pattern to the uptake pattern of phosphorus. So there's potassium, there's phosphorus. Notice any difference? I'll try and go back. I'm getting risky with this new pointer. There's potassium, there's phosphorus. Wow. First of all, phosphorus uptake is longer, 70 days instead of 50s. And in fact, the soybean plant has to take up 45% of its phosphorus after flowering. And it has a huge seed requirement. Got the highest harvest index of any of the elements, 80%. 80%. So based on these uptake patterns and some of my research trials, I'm not going to have time to show you, what I see is that phosphorus is the element that's most limiting soybean productivity. It has the way to do with how we're fertilizing or not fertilizing soybean. All right, well, moving on. What is number 3? All right, I don't know about you guys, but I agonize long and hard over what corn hybrid I'm going to grow, and then I turn around and buy any old damn soybean. I don't care. Is it round? Sure. Plant it. Big mistake. Number 3 is variety and genetics. And oh boy, all soybean varieties aren't created equal either. I'm going to show you 17 soybean varieties that were grown at my site, Central Illinois. I think it's in 2015. And I'm going to rank these soybean varieties according to their yield. So I'm showing you 17 varieties here. I've ranked them according to their yield. And the difference between the highest and the lowest is 23 bushels. Man, 23 bushels. It doesn't sound like much when I'm used to talking about corn, but this is soybean. 23 bushels. Now, by the way, this is in Central Illinois. And in Central Illinois, we would grow maturity groups that would be in the 2.5 to 4 region. 2.5 to 4. And so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to superimpose on this list what the relative maturity of these soybean cultivars was. So I've done that here. So again, I'm showing you the relative maturity here as a function of yield. And while it's not a hard and fast rule, what I want you to notice is on this side that has the low yields, there's a lot of 2s. And on this side that has the higher yields, there aren't any 2s. In general, what I see is the fuller the relative maturity that you can get by with, the higher the potential yield. I think it has something to do with using the whole season. I mean, I'm not sure, but it's just a wild guess. And this is especially true if you plant early, if you catch the August rains, and if you manage it. In general, the highest relative maturity for the region gives the highest yield. And by the way, I'm pretty sure this doesn't cost you anymore, so you look like a genius when you use this approach. I can't tell you how many guys in Illinois I deal with that plant 2.5s. And I say, why are you planting a 2.5? And they say, oh, we got a lot of soybean to harvest. We got to get the combine out after Labor Day. Okay, giving up a lot of yield for that luxury. Usually the fullest maturity for the region gives the highest yield. I'll tell you another advantage of this. I don't know about you guys, but by the time I get around to harvesting my soybean, the damn thing's dropped to 8% seed moisture. And I'm giving the elevator a few free bushels. Makes me want to take out the garden hose. But when I harvest a full maturity, use the whole season, get her higher yield, it's closer to 13% moisture. You know, so I get those free bushels too. All right, well, moving on. What's number 4? And this has to do with the growth habit of soybean. The growth habit of soybean is indeterminate. And indeterminate means it can grow flowers and leaves at the same time. And I'm pretty sure a soybean cultivar you would grow around here would have 20 nodes, 16 of them could have pods. And guess what? It's the closest leaf that supplies most of the energy for the pods and beans at a given node. So in other words, these pods get their energy from this leaf, these pods get their energy from that leaf. The ones that are going to be there are going to get their energy from this leaf. Get it? It's the closest leaf that supplies most of the energy. And so because of this, number 4 is foliar protection. Protecting those leaves from insects or diseases. Now, if you got a magic stress relief compound, it fits into this category as well. Foliar protection. Now, one of the reasons that foliar protection is so important has to do with the yield components of soybean. So you can make soybean yield into a math equation by multiplying the 3 yield components together. I call this my yield algorithm. I don't actually have a clue what an algorithm is, but I think it has something to do with math. So soybean yield is a product function of how many pods you have per acre. It's not plants, because you know the damn thing branches, and it's got multiple nodes that can have pods, and more than one pod at a node. So soybean yield is a product function of pod number per acre, seeds per pod, weight per seed. And a change in any one of these can be responsible for a change in soybean yield. Now, normally I'm going to tell you that pod number per acre is primarily a function of weather and fertility. I'm going to tell you that seeds per pod, that is a genetic trait. Man, I can't tell you how much time I spent looking for that 5-bean pod when it was worth something. Has anybody ever found a 5-bean pod? Anybody? I don't feel so bad. I've never found a 5-bean pod either, but my student found one. He tried to sell it to me, but I took a picture of it instead, which worked just as well. So there it is, the legendary 5-bean pod. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. By the way, you could also have a 6-bean with the biology of soybean flowers. A 5-bean pod next to a 4-bean pod. That's a genetic trait. That is the value that the Roundup 2 trait brings to soybean yield. More 4 and 5-bean pods. Now, I won't tell you that you can't find a 5-bean pod in a Liberty Link or a Roundup 1 soybean. You can. But there are more of them in a Roundup 2 trait. So that is a genetic trait. And so that's one of the reasons that foliar protection is so important. Another reason that foliar protection is so important is that if I can increase the seed weight, you know what a typical soybean seed weighs? 150 milligrams. See, I use the metric milligram to make that appear more scientific. So a soybean seed weighs 150 milligrams. If I could make it weigh 152 milligrams, if I can increase the seed weight 2 milligrams, that's a bushel. And so that's another reason that foliar protection is so important. Now, if I come back to the yield components, and I asked which one of these is the most important. You know how you do a soybean yield estimate? Right? You take the hula hoop, and you throw it out, and you count all the pods, and then you make up some yield after that, right? That's how it's done. So pod number per acre is the most important one. Now, I have another question for you. Where are most of the pods on the soybean plant? I'm going to make this into multiple choice. Where are most of the pods on the soybean plant? Are they at the bottom, the middle, the top, the branches, or is it equally distributed? 5 choices. Bottom, middle, top, branches, equal. Where are most of the pods on the soybean plant? By the way, I know where they are because I have graduate students, and you can send the graduate student out there to count them. I mean, you could squeeze a lot of juice out of the grad student while you're blackmailing them for their degree. And the answer is the middle. What I'm showing you here, this is pod number as a function of node number. So 0 is the bottom, 20 is the top. I've removed the branches. The branches would all be down here. Branches are overrated. Only 10% of the yield comes from branches. 60% of the yield from the middle. 60% of the soybean yield comes from the middle, from nodes 7 through 13. Now, this is what 50 bushel soybean looks like. What do you suppose 62 bushel yield looks like? Well, it looks like that. It's still the middle. 62, see, a few more here, a few more there, it's still the middle. Now, by the way, I did the math, and 62 bushel soybean is 50 bushels, is 62 bushel soybean is 12 bushels more than 50. Can I do that math in my head fast? 12 bushels more than 50, and it's only 6 more pods. If you can put 1 more pod on every soybean plant, just one more pod on every soybean plant is worth 2 bushels. That seems easy, doesn't it? I said, well, geez, I'll just put 10 more pods at the top. Oh, there's plenty of room, and that'll be a 20 bushel increase in yield. It's not as easy as it sounds. I mean, I tried duct tape, doesn't work. If you have a high soybean yield, you know where I'm going to see it? I'm going to see it at the top of the plant. I'm going to come out and I'm going to look at those upper nodes. They're going to have 3 and 4 bean clusters. I'm going to get really excited, because 60% comes from the middle. And that, by the way, is another reason why foliar protection is so important. If you put an R3 spray on soybean, R3, guess what leaves you're protecting? Leaves 7 through 13, where 60% of the yield comes from. Another reason. All right, well, what about number 5? Number 5 has to do with all the fantastic stuff that you could put on the seed. And this would include your inoculum, your micronutrient, your biological. But the seed treatment I'm going to talk about is protecting the seed from insects, diseases, and nematodes. Now, I know you guys know the answer to this. You know what you call a seed that has a soybean seed that has no seed treatment other than cheaper. What's it called? What's a soybean seed with no seed treatment called? It's called naked. Naked. God, do I love the sound of that. Naked. Talk about sexy. It gets me a little aroused, actually. And I'm here to tell you, man, there's a lot of different seed treatments you have. There are at least 50 different shades of seed treatment. Where are they? There they are. 50 different shades. By the way, including gray. But it's a little abusive, so I didn't show it. But see the naked one there? Talk about sexy. So, as sexy it is, I hate the result. Because typically, when I compare naked seed to treated seed, not only, less of them emerge. So this is another grad student exercise, by the way. Treated seed compared to naked seed, between 5 and 15,000 more seed emerge per acre. 5 and 15,000 seed more from treatment. I know it doesn't sound like much, but now that soybean seed is getting more expensive, not only do more emerge, but they grow faster after they emerge. And I'm telling you, this is especially true if we plant early and we have a cold, wet spring. Sometimes we can see this difference in yield all the way into the first week of July. And so I show you an example of this. This same soybean cultivar planted the same day. Here's one that has the full seed treatment. And here's the seed here. This seed, it isn't even naked. Look at it, it's got a fungicide on it. So I'll tell you what, I'm gonna call this one scantily clad, and I'll call this one fully clothed. By the way, usually I like scantily clad compared to fully clothed, but not when it comes to seed treatment. Hope you can see the difference. I'm telling you, you can see this difference right to the row. So there's the scantily clad one there, the fungicide only. There's the complete seed treatment. And see this? This is an expensive scientific instrument that we call a rulerometer, that we can actually quantify that difference in growth. And then number 6 is row spacing. Wide rows, narrow rows. I heard Rachel tell you that 15-inch rows generally yield better than 30-inch rows. I see the exact same thing. Man, that's a big one, especially in certain weather years, and especially if you manage it. So the advantage of a narrow row over a wide row is you intercept more light. All right, the disadvantage of a narrow row over a wide row is, I don't know about here, but in my state, we have hard-to-control leaf diseases like white mold. So if you hear me talk later about corn, I'm going to talk about 20-inch rows. I know that a lot of narrow row soybean now is 15-inch rows. But I got a 4-row planter, and I can't plant a 15-inch row without putting every other row in a tire track. So my narrow row is a 20-inch row. And I'm going to tell you, the compromise here of a 20-inch row is more light interception and a little bit more air movement down that row to control those hard-to-control leaf diseases. All right, so these are my 6 secrets of soybean success. These are the 6 things, the management things that you can do every year to positively impact your soybean yield. So I'm going to conclude here, and I'm going to tell you that you can increase soybean yield with crop management. This is an epiphany. Who would have thought? I've told you that phosphorus, soil fertility, particularly phosphorus, is one of the most important factors. At least it's the one we're overlooking the most. You know, I know we're all worried about water quality and this kind of stuff, but you know, this is what I see as one of the elements that affects soybean the most. I told you there's no such thing as a soybean nitrogen credit. Soybean does not add N to the soil. If I teach you anything, remember that. It's a corn residue penalty. Soybean removes more N than it fixes. I told you that variety makes a big difference. And usually the fullest maturity variety for the region gives the highest yield, especially if you plant early, especially if you get August rain, and especially if you manage it. All right, I also told you that 60% of the yield comes from the middle. Nodes 7 through 13, those are the ones you protect with an R3 spray. That's the key time. And then I also told you that if you can add just one more pod to every soybean plant, that's worth 2 bushels. A lot of opportunity to increase soybean yield. So sadly, you're not done with me yet. I'm going to give you indigestion after lunch talking about corn. So I'll wait to acknowledge the people that I should be acknowledging until then. But in the meantime, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you here this morning.